international NGO based in Berlin and Bangalore. And we work broadly in the field of what we call information activism, info activism. You can follow us on Twitter, @info_activism. And so, two main areas of work is digital security. We work with human rights defenders and activists in the global south to stay safe online. So part of this means running training workshops showing them how to encrypt their email, producing guides. We have a guide called Security in a Box, which is insanely popular. And we help people to be aware of the digital traces they leave behind online when they're using the internet. That's a project called Me and My Shadow. And then the other side of our work is more around creative campaigning and creative activism. And that's where this book comes in. Because we've just written a ginormous book, and before it disappears around the room, I'm just going to show it to you. It actually went to printers yesterday. And so it's going to be coming out very soon. And so the idea behind this is that activists are increasingly working with vast amounts of data and information. And instead of putting it into 60-page reports, we want them to communicate it in more interesting and visual ways. So based on that, we wrote a 106-page book, packed with visuals and advice and tips for what we've learned over the past 10 years of working with activists and designers and how to communicate the right message to the right audience. Please come in, sit down. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a bit today. Maya and I are going to tag team a presentation, a bit about the book, and then we're going to invite you to join us in a little competition, and then there's going to be question time.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about something really topical and something that's very popular and being very heatedly discussed on the internet right now in India. As most of you know, there was a really horrific incident of gang rape in Delhi last year in December. And since then, there's been a really unprecedented level of conversation online and through social media and in the mainstream media in, mostly middle-class population talking about what this means for us and why did it happen and how we're responding to it. And so this is, there's a campaign that came out last week called the Abused Goddesses campaign. It was created by an advertising agency called Taproot as part of a campaign for another organization called Save the Children. And what this campaign has is, it's a print campaign, a series of visuals of Hindu goddesses. This one is Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. And you see the image of the goddess, but she bears the mark of violence, and all of them do. So this is another visual from the campaign. So Hindu goddesses are usually very popular. You see them everywhere. They always look very beautiful. They're beautifully dressed. What's grabbed people's attention with this campaign is that these goddesses have bruises and marks of violence on them. Now, what's interesting is the conversation happening around this campaign. So there are two camps primarily. You've got one group that thinks this campaign is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's amazing. It's so powerful. Like BuzzFeed was very breathless about it and called it like an incredibly moving and powerful campaign. And then you have a smaller community online. These people are mostly activists, academics, people actually involved with activism and work around sort of addressing gender issues and violence against women. So this smaller community is very critical of this campaign. And they feel that, for one thing, why Hinduism? Why are we promoting these Hindu icons? We are a very diverse country. They also feel, why must we be compared to goddesses to get our rights as human beings? And there's a lot of very, gender insensitive practices and ideas and thoughts within Hinduism. So why are we trying to promote this? Now the thing is, I will admit, I find myself part of the group that's more critical of this campaign. But the truth is that this has been a very, very powerful campaign, and a lot of people are talking about it. And one of the bits of conversation that's been missed out in this debate is responding to the visuals in this campaign as a visual campaign itself, not so much going into the politics of the visual and the politics of representation, which is a separate issue. And the reason I wanted to start talking about this campaign is because it's very much to do with the subject of our book, Visualizing Information for Advocacy. Now, This campaign, the images in this campaign would fall into the first of 3 categories for organizing visual information that we've talked about in the book. And so there are these 3 categories: are get the idea, get the picture, and get the detail. So the first one is called get the idea. And get the idea is about using visuals that grab your attention. And this one has definitely grabbed people's attention. It's about sending out a very strong, powerful, fairly precise message with not too much data and information. Like this one. This is another one on women's rights by Amnesty International, and it draws attention to female genital mutilation, or FGM. And there's text at the bottom which says, that FGM is a really bad thing, but the visual is very arresting because it shows you, well, you know what this is. And if you don't know about female genital mutilation, you learn that there are actually 3 different kinds of FGM, and the way in which the rose petals are stitched up tell you about those 3 different kinds. Again, interestingly, we showed this particular image at a large women's rights conference last year in Istanbul, and we had a lot of women's rights activists finding this very, very problematic. They were getting into the politics of representation and saying, oh, why must a woman's body be compared to a flower, and all the attendant, connotations with that. However, it is quite an arresting campaign, visual campaign. So this is another example of get the idea, grabs your attention. This is another one we've featured in the book. This is by Adopted Children of the World Trust in India, and it draws attention to adoption. And it's trying to say that, get beyond whether a child is, produced biologically or whether you've adopted the child. What's important is how you care for the child, and parenting and child rearing. And it does that in a really, I think this is a really wonderful and compelling image. And I'm going to, and this is another one that we've used in Get the Idea. Again, really beautiful image. It's almost like a Rothko painting. So this is created by a French-Canadian artist and designer called Kamal Makhloufi, and it visualizes the number of people, the kinds of people killed in 1 year in Iraq, and the data is based on data released by WikiLeaks via The Guardian and the Afghan war logs. So what he did was, this is called function. So the image on that side is deaths in Iraq over 1 year as a function of time. Okay, so for every single person killed in Iraq over that 1 year. The same data is represented on this side as a function of sum. So the blue at the top is people killed in friendly fire. The turquoise is enemies, host country troops. These are Iraqi civilians, and these are enemies. Now, of course, all of these are Iraqis. And what Makhloufi is trying to do through this image is not dilute the scale of the massacre in Iraq and draw attention to it. When you see the image like that and you hear the stories on the news, you're fairly desensitized to what's going on. It's just another death, just another story. But when you show the information like this, you're immediately kind of, you can see the disparity and the distinction. Okay.
So that was
the next one, which Emma talked about.
Get the idea. Now we're going on to get the picture. So the idea that you've collected your data, and you've spent hours making sure that the methodology is right, it's used to be cleaned and analysed, and what you do with it, and you want to use it all. And we're saying, please don't. Think carefully. Find the story in it. Pull out the few ideas you want to communicate. So get the picture is about carefully curating a story for your audience. It's about putting an issue into context or scale, about getting people to understand something that's maybe more complex, but the idea of quickly sketching something onto a piece of paper to explain it. That's what we mean by get the picture. So into this comes infographics. Might be fair to say we're all a bit plagued by infographics these days, but they do. They can work. There is a reason we turn to kind of graphs and basic visual comparisons, is because they do work. This one, I don't know how well people can see, but this is about the amount of water used, specifically in the meat industry, and it takes you through an individual day. So you have like rise and shine, or going to the zoo, you have your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, and they're showing you options. So for dinner you can have beef, and this is how much water is used. Or alternatively, you can have chicken, and that's how much. So it's just a very simple way. And it's quite nice because it takes you through your very personal day-to-day story. So that's one example. This one is, I think, more about bringing new perspective onto something that's well-discussed issue. This is a Palestinian showing the 19 documents he needs to travel outside of his country. And it just is a whole new take on something you probably know very well. And you can just, bit by bit plod through the 3 passports, the various different kind of identification documents, and you immediately start to think of yourself and how, I don't know where everyone's from here, but as a European, it's fairly easy to get around, and it makes you really think about the problem in a new light. And this one, I'm really fond of this one. So this one is diplomatic parking violations in New York City from 1998 to 2002. It's actually diplomats who haven't paid their fines. And 140,000 data points are behind this image. This was insanely complex data, and they have made it so readable and so kind of instantly you get the story that the Egyptians, are a bit dodgy, and the Swedes are keen. And it makes you ask also, what on earth happens around here? It looks like someone definitely got scolded, because things get better and better. Again, so it's choosing, they had this massive data set, and these were some designers, and they carefully chose what they wanted to pull out of it and how they wanted to show it. Here we go. And so the next final 3 of our gets, this is get the detail. And this is probably most relevant to open data and open data projects. The idea that you put all of your data out there. And I think we're all familiar with Open Knowledge Foundations. Where does my money go? So this is budget data in the UK, and it's dry as hell. Who's going to look through it? And they've just made a great visual, so you can look at it regionally, by department, and importantly, you can put in your own personal salary and see how much of your taxes goes to different departments. It's just a very clever way to make a massive data set digestible. So we talk about get the details projects, because they bring kind of transparency and credibility to your organisation projects. In some ways, it's about just making the evidence that you're using open, so making it more neutral so people can sift through it themselves. And often it's about them finding the story and the data that's relevant to them. It's usually a bit more tech-heavy than the other kind of GETS projects we've spoken about. So this one was the, let me get this right actually, I always get the name of this one. Okay, so this is a digital monument to the Jewish community in the Netherlands. They had a database of all Jews who were killed under the Nazi occupation. And they didn't know what to do with it. And they very cleverly decided to release it online. And in the same way that we saw that the Iraqi civilian deaths image, in that every pixel of colour was an individual, the same way here, every pixel here is an individual. So if you click through to the next slide, you get this was a Jew who was killed under Nazi occupation. They put all the information they had online and asked people to fill in the holes. And in the 5 years when they launched the project, they had 28,000 contributions of people submitting photos, stories of the grandparents, clarifying information. I mean, so this is basically crowdsourcing, but where it's worked. It's a really successful example. Yeah. And this is Trevor Paglen. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. He's an American artist and geographer. And he likes to ask awkward questions to the US military. So this was about CIA rendition flights. And he wanted to know where they were going, what was happening. And so he started collecting news articles and looking at kind of all non-commercial carriers. He managed to interview a couple of pilots who were on these rendition flights. And he worked together with a colleague, John Emerson, and they produced a map and they put it on a billboard. It's actually quite hard to see, but one of the main points of this is that it shows really mundane locations in America, like Fort Lauderdale, and Tulsa, and places that the average American knows, which is where these rendition flights are going in and out of. And this is, I think, interesting because it's completely offline. They took a huge data set and they put it just on a street in LA. I guess you all know who this is. This is Ai Weiwei. Another example of using the visual in advocacy. He started campaigning after the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. There were a lot of children who were killed because the schools were famously shoddily built. What's it called?
Tofu skin schools.
Tofu skin schools. And the authorities weren't releasing any information on the numbers. And so Ai Weiwei, 50 volunteers, went around to all these villages and interviewed people to ask them if they've lost their children. They collected 5,800 names, and he documented the whole process on his blog. His blog was censored, one of the activists was arrested, but they have this amazing list of printouts, just names, and they just put it on walls for people to see. And building on this, he then started creating a couple of art projects, and got individual stories from people and put them on kids' backpacks and did some wacky Ai Weiwei things there. Again, a really kind of surprising and inspiring example of what people do with data and how they communicate data and how they use it for advocacy.
Okay, so just to kind of go over the three, and we're going to pass the book around, and we'll tell you about where all of this is online. I realize we've kind of just run through these three categories. So this table, I think, is quite useful to see how the three are related and how they're different. So we've got get the idea, get the picture, get the detail that we just talked about, and what the three do. So get the idea is kind of exposing an issue. Get the picture is explaining and allowing you to find a narrative in the data, and get the detail allows you to explore and find the storyline that you want to through it. What's also interesting about this, if you notice, is get the idea kinds of presentations of information are very heavily visual with small amounts of data, and as you go down, you're getting less visual and a lot more data. So typically these are also done via print and strong images, and these are more sort of interactive data sets and are mostly online. Like making some of this stuff offline is really hard, but I mean there are some examples. And in the book, what we do is we sort of unpackage a number of different examples under these three and show how, sort of analyze how they've been created and how they've been used, and have interviews with many of the people who've created these examples. And I think, do you want to talk about how people can get the book now?
Yes.
Yeah, and then we open up to questions maybe.
So, went to print yesterday, which is very exciting. It's going to be out on the 1st of October. There is pre-order set up. The website is visualisingadvocacy.org. Please take a look. It's shiny and brand spanking new. You can have a quick look at some samples in the Take a Peek section. We have some visualization tools. These this all came out of a previous project we had called Drawing by Numbers. Has anyone in this room heard of Drawing by Numbers? I'm curious. Maya and I presented this time, exact time last year, OK Fest in Helsinki on Drawing by Numbers. So we took Drawing by Numbers and we just made it a bazillion times better, and we produced this book. And so there's visualization tool reviews, and then Get the Book shows you the big fat buy button. We are also, if you're working in this, you are an NGO, you're working with activists on these kind of issues, we're also open to discussing free copies and that kind of thing. But for today, we have a special plan, which was 5 free copies for the 5 people who tweet their favourite visual, preferably a visual used for campaigning or advocacy at us, with hashtag BizGuide, hashtag OKCon, and we will get in touch and send you free copies.
Yes, you had a question, Heather.
First of all, I just want to tell you that at the door, we've turned away about 25 people minimum.
Oh.
So congratulations. Really, really relevant. That's the first thing. So I did see in Toronto, Canada, the Ai Weiwei exhibition was there, and they actually have, apparently he has a wall in his house, or in his studio rather, of all the names, but the exhibition had people stating the names, and so when you talk about info and activism, I think it's really important to put the human in it, and I think just by using art to do that, it was really powerful to see. He also had the steel rods. He went out into the field, got the physical steel rods that were holding up these shoddy schools, and made that part of his art display. So using the physical and the online was really fantastically done. So I'm glad you mentioned that example. It's beautiful and terrifying.
Yeah, I think that example is really nice because it's a way to make information that's very simple but can be really boring, make it extremely human, and it sort of gives you a new perspective also on what art itself means. So you become very aware of the process of what it means to create something visual, to create something artistic. It's, I mean, there's this question, you know, what does an artist do all day? And a project like Ai Weiwei's, I think really puts you, sort of opens the whole process up, puts all the data out there, and, you know, actually printing out the names of children who died on pieces of paper and sticking them up
and
on
I
the
should
wall.
say he actually forced the authorities who then released the official figures.
And continues to collect.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you measure somehow the impact that you can say this visualization is better, it's 2 times better than that?
Well, I think, I mean, in the book, with some examples, we do talk about how they work, but I think that's for individuals who create that visualization. So the example I started with, the abused goddesses, I would reckon that Taproot should think that their campaign is extremely powerful and has been successful, but it's also about asking, what do you want people to do? They've given one statistic in that campaign, for example, 68% of women in India experience domestic violence. And the message is that, you know, the only women who are spared are the ones that we pray to. Now, if you just want to grab people's attention, yes, it's done that. But is it going to address all the problems of violence and how it happens? No, but that's not the point of the campaign. And I think that's the point we miss sometimes when we look at the questions of impact. And I think something that's important for us and that we're going to be doing is also trying to make a distinction between impact and influence. And saying what is the influence of a campaign, especially something that's visual. And I think that, you know, I mean, that's a question that's quite loaded and interesting, therefore, to explore.
I guess kind of half a comment, half a question, really. Like you, I'm by background a researcher, but also a campaigner. And I think that first example you showed with Hindu Goddess is a great example of how, in my imagination, probably a campaign designed by probably some quite middle-class Indians or maybe some international donors, and they think, great, this is something we feel we should be hearing.
Yeah.
But that's entirely for the voice of the campaigner and not for the voice of the audience. And so, particularly for that probably quite expensive campaign, it's really important you actually find out what your audience, both before you design it, want to know and how they think, but also when you've done your creative, how they respond to it as well, because you might actually be counterproductive in the worst case, or not have much impact. And I wonder how, for some of the work that you've done, how you've gone about, if you go about testing with any audiences, and if you do, how you do it.
Well, we have, I mean, thank you for that. I think that's also another really sticky, complicated issue, looking at audience and how things can misfire and backfire, because things just do go out there, and what you do with, you have to sort of think about the impact, talk about the implications of a campaign. So in the book, we've talked about this campaign called Chevron We Agree, which was done by Rainforest Action Network. Are you familiar with it? And a lot of people really liked the campaign, but whether it affects big oil and what it does to big oil is very minimal. I mean, our analysis and understanding of it is that it brings together people in the echo chamber. So it sort of confirms things for people who believe that big oil is terrible. And it's true, big oil is. But then does big oil care? No, they don't. And I think, I mean, that one had a lot of repercussions. I mean, it's very hard, for a long time it was very hard to even look at the campaign website. What Rainforest Action Network did is that they spoofed corporate campaign by Chevron, and the timing was really critical and important. They did it a couple of hours before Chevron released their own campaign. So they basically spun the US media, which thought that the parody campaign by the activists was the actual Chevron campaign. And what the activists were doing was saying things that an oil company would never say, which is about their accountability to communities, to the environment. So I think, I mean, we do sort of go into that and talk about audiencing and looking at some of those sorts of examples. The one thing that we do right at the start of the guide is to look at what are the different elements within the space of information activism. So visual design is only one of them. You've also got to understand technology and technology platforms. You've got to understand audience. You've got to understand networks. think about the kind of influence you want to have, and are you appealing to people's morality and ethics, or are you appealing to logic and rationality? So we kind of lay that out in the beginning, and we didn't want to go into it too much here. I mean, that's something that I think is better read than talked about. So yeah, I hope that kind of responds to it. And we'll send this around maybe now if people want to start taking a look.
As an information visualization consumer, whenever I see a visualization like that Raki one you basically showed before, it does spark emotions, and that also leads me to ask, what are the underlying assumptions in creating this visualization? What is the data lineage? Where does it come from? How does it process the data? Generally speaking, I've seen a lot of visualizations, as she mentioned, about the plague of infographics, and we don't have that practice yet observed by the creative artists to actually document and publicize how they created this data and how what sort of assumptions they took. So do you as a team acknowledge this as a common concern among consumers? And if so, then do you provide any recommendations of to further visualization enthusiasts to consider?
Okay, I understand that there's maybe 2 or 3 things in what you're saying. So correct me if I'm wrong, or don't sort of address them all. I think that's like a really fantastic tactic, and that's the prerogative of the designer to say there's either absences or gaps or problems with the data, or we want to expose the process of how we've actually collected the information and where it's coming from, and that's entirely valid, but it has to work within the narrative of the visual, but also the story you're trying to tell. I think there are some kinds of campaigns where, or some kinds of ways of putting information out there where it's not so important where it came from, but being able to present a particular storyline within it. And I don't think I'm getting the rest of what you said.
Well, they say beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. 2 people can see the same data set and would like to present a totally different story. But part of that story could be based on their own particular biases, what they really want to believe in that data. So it's very easy to confuse between actual knowledge extraction, which can be radically different than my own understandings or my own belief, as compared to what is the bias I want to propagate, using emotions which the storytelling and visualization can tell me. I mean, this is one of the issues I basically have with, when I look at visualizations, that what is this person's agenda versus what is the actual data telling me, and what am I missing out in this data set?
Yeah, I think that's what you're referring to is a problem, because we have the ability now to be able to create a lot of visualizations, and in the book we sort of talk about the hazards of overdoing it. So each of these 3, get the idea, get the picture, get the details. There are pitfalls and downsides to just being able to create visualizations, and we, especially in the get the picture question chapter, we say, just because you can, should you visualize? You know, is it important to make a map, to put things on a map, or create an infographic just because you can? And that's why you have this plague of infographics. And the person who is not data literate is going to take everything at face value, or is going to think that it's really fantastic to be able to create visualizations. And that's sort of tricky balancing act that, you know, we're trying to promote in our work, to say, before you actually run off and make that visualization, think about what you're trying to do with it. Should you just populate the internet with more and more crap visualizations? And it's, I think, very few of us who know and understand the world of data and are able to pull out things like biases and say that, you know, there are different ways to flip the same story depending on how you analyze the data, how you present the data. I think that's a very valid point, and something that we do address in the guide itself, and something that we try to do in our workshops and you know, capacity building that we do. Do you want to add anything? Oh, sorry, I think Juan also wanted to say something.
Just putting the question about, like, how do you address the use of focus groups in terms of like trying to validate the visual approach and the usage, you know, to achieve an objective, an advocacy objective with a certain audience? Because it's something that in, like, from the non-profit sector, we're not used to that, but the guys from the industry are so used to that, and they know their audience is so much better than us.
Yeah, I think that it sort of comes up in that bit about thinking about your audience. We don't go into specific details of how you can do that, but we do talk about strategy. We do talk about measuring your audience.
There's a whole section called Putting It into Practice, where we talk about our experience of working with designers, of creating, creating visual messages. And it's from inside Tactical Tech, it's what we do. And we say, design the message, design the visual, show it to your friends, show it to your mum, take it around the office. It's my focus group, slightly smaller scale. But we do have a whole practical chapter like, of our experience and share.
But eventually I think it's about that particular organization and what it's trying to do. And even identifying your audience is a challenge for many groups, as we know, and we can often get it wrong. So.
I will just refer to the colleague over here because I think that he put one more question and I didn't quite get the answer. I got interested also in it. So we speak here about the data presentation and I see it from the very artistic side. But is it like, by default that we attach also the source from where we got this data from? Or is it more in the artistic way that we show it in a nice way, but we don't know from where this data comes from?
Well, most of these campaigns, the really good campaigns, actually tell you where the data is coming from. The campaigns, the examples of Get the Idea, for example, which are just very strong visuals, some of those don't mention where the data is coming from because they're not really about data, it's about a message. So like the adoption one, okay, that's sending you a very strong message. Now the idea is if you're interested, go and actually look at adoption in more detail. However, the one from Iraq about the deaths in Iraq tells you what the source of information is. The abused goddesses one actually uses a statistic there, 68%, and in the legend they say that this is based on data from such and such source. So I think that's something that people are, just looking at what's happening around, I think that people are cognizant of being able to put their sources out there and say where information is coming from. But it really depends on what the objective is of the visual campaign that you're doing.
And then the other question. So I started to think also, if we have right now this open data trend, and we are getting more and more data from the government, I'm just thinking, so assuming that, that we have these resources and we can visualize them in a different way, do you think that in the final effect this is something also what will be used by the political parties to present their, rights assumptions during elections? Or do you think, like we presented today, it will be more a way to help people realize some things? Like, for example, in Iraq you said about these things, about in India about the other one, to kind of show the truth to the people. I don't know whether you know what I mean.
No.
No? Okay, so very simple. Will it be used as a manipulation tool by the political parties, or it will be more a way to show what is really happening, like, for example, with the economical issues also within the countries and how we can solve some issues? Because many political parties, they have their political programs, economical programs, how we can decrease unemployment, how we can increase export, how we can improve the economic situation within the country. So do you think that it will be something, because I see that more data is coming, I see that it's more, open source, so different people can use it in different way, but do you think the final effect that this is something that will help us to understand what is really standing behind the economical ration?
Well, I think that all data can be manipulated, all visuals can be made to manipulate. So, as you were saying, you can slice your data in different ways to tell a particular story and very conveniently leave others out. I'm not going to bring up that old, adage about statistics, but I think it does go back to that. And when you have people who are not data literate, you're going to find it easier to manipulate somebody's ideas about something. And I think in a plural society, you must have you know, a number of people from different perspectives all able to look at the same data set or the same visual, be able to challenge it and talk about it. I mean, that's what makes for conversation in any society. So I think, yes, everything can be used to manipulate and nothing is neutral. And it all comes with intent. I think what we're trying to say with this is there are many opportunities to get your message out there. That's part of the nature of influence. I mean, you can use it to persuade people through very naked kinds of, messaging and very obvious kinds of messaging to put a certain message out there to lobby. But you can also put information out there for accountability. And that's what sort of strategic documentation is about. So when you're trying to expose an issue, you put all the data out there. One of the examples we haven't talked about, but is in the book, is to show climate change skeptics and where they're located. And it's a project called Exxon Secrets by Greenpeace. And that's a really good way of looking at the fact that there is a lot of very questionable and conflicting data around climate change. And there are academics who are part of that as well. And so what Exxon Secrets does is it allows the viewer to go into an interactive database and look at which senator, which company, who's speaking where, who's funded by what, which think tank or policy group is putting out which paper, and who are they networked with, connected to. And that's, I think, an attempt to address the fact that you can manipulate information and choose to portray it in the way that you want to.
I have another question related to visualization. I'm a big fan of Edward Stuff and Stephen Few's work, and all the, you can say, hate he has for pie charts and all because of the angular cognitive perceptions we have. I see a lot of consumer behavior that eventually if I build my data and there's bar charts are supposed to be the best way to present a story, they're very boring. They don't present that emotions, and people would like to go with these fancy, flashy, and at times this misleading visualization tools like a pie chart, for example, or a donut chart, worse than that. How would you say, when you talk about data literacy of the consumers, that how would you go about taking that challenge and bridge the gap between the right visualization they should use versus what they actually want? Actually, Stephen Few and them are minority groups, to be honest, I mean, specifically, even till today. How would you tackle that challenge?
If I can hack the question, just also put the cultural differences on the same question.
Well, I think that first there's a distinction between consumer research and things that are used within marketing to influence and manipulate people, and what advocates are trying to do, but also not sometimes. Everyone's trying to sort of promote a certain idea through the data that they have. I think all you can have is just more people being able to say, like The Guardian, for example, does a really good job of talking about what's wrong with data visualization. Recently they had this really excellent piece called Don't Trust a Data Visualization, and it tells you why you shouldn't trust a data visualization. And I think there are actually resources out there which say, think about what you're trying to do with this. Are you trying to compare and contrast? If so, these are the kinds of actual representations, the shapes that are useful. If you're trying to show networks, this is what's useful. And this is something else that doesn't work. So I think I'm not sure if I'm responding to your question, but I think that alongside data literacy, obviously you need visual literacy as well. And sometimes you see this divide where people who really know the data don't know how to read visuals, and people who really know how to read visuals and manipulate them don't often understand data. That gap is much smaller in certain communities like interaction designers or people who actually create interactive and dynamic visualizations often understand that. And I think in data journalism, this is something being talked about as well, that what's the best way to present this information, and it's of the times, it's something you have to learn, and I feel like there are resources out there. What do you mean by respond to it culturally?
Is data visualization just a Western hype, or is it like?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are. I agree. I actually have had this long-standing, long-running issue when I feel like in the West, you can, like your carton of orange juice will have a pie chart on it telling you that you're getting your 5 a day or getting, whatever is the breakup of nutrients in that orange juice. There's a visualization of it, and there's this idea that, in other cultures we read things differently, we tell visual stories differently. I'm inclined to believe that, but I don't actually have enough. I mean, that's a question that I would love to explore, to say how do you learn to read things in different cultures and what's relevant and what's not. But the thing is, if you bombard a particular place with a particular thing, it's going to pick up, and there are going to be people who will read those things. Now, whether they're, I think some things, like with the whole violence against women in India, for example, there is a solidly middle class, socially mediated community that knows how to read visuals, or is kind of starting to read visuals. I'm not saying that they're really successful at it, and it's kind of exposing the visual illiteracy and data illiteracy that's around, but people are learning it because it's something that's relevant to them. Elections is another big thing that has always traditionally used a lot of graphics in different parts of the world to show the results, basically. So I think that's a very valuable question, and I don't know the answer to it.
May I have a take on that? We were working once with a client in China, and they specifically told us, do not put your red flags as red. Put them as orange or yellow or any other color, because red for them is a good color.
Yeah.
So do not take that as a bad indication. Do not do that. So I think colors at least do have a difference in culture, so you have to consider those in your visualization about your audience figure.
I think that's kind of part of the visual literacy and design thinking around, and I think that's something that designers are quite sensitive to, and good designers will be very sensitive to those ideas, kind of understanding the community that they're trying to talk to, and go into those kinds of details. But absolutely, I think that's probably a subset of a much larger issue of how things are read visually.
How can I buy an electronic version?
You're going to have to wait a few months. We're doing hard copy. Old school.
Yeah, we want people to actually go out there and, get a book.
I know because you're going to ship it to Brazil.
We can do that.
Alright.
Bangalore to Brazil. We can do that.
We're going to be doing a lot of distribution and in different ways. So we will send things to people, but we're also going to make it accessible through online platforms like, booksellers that are online and Amazon and things like that. So
It's
there's,
going to take 2 months.
yeah,
We
but
just get
Right.
enough money.
Yeah.
It's print. One day at a time.
What about translating it to
Yes.
our languages?
yes, please.
You're welcome.
All our stuff is always Creative Commons. It's open. The last big project we did around translation, 10 tactics, as well as our security in a box. They're in lots of languages because we just sort of put it out there and tell people, you want to make this accessible to people in your country, please volunteer to translate it, to subtitle films. And so it's completely open to that. And we already have friends, I think, who want to translate into Russian and Spanish, of course. And so please get in touch. We're very happy to have people just translate it.
Sorry, I'm asking too many questions. Maybe I should get a book for free or
Nice one. We'll think about that.
Yeah. What's your take on static images versus the moving visualization, animated visualizations? How do you basically see the two together? Is it adding complexity, or does it add value, or any specific context
It
it works
depends on
with?
what you're trying to do. Like if the static image works for the campaign and the community or the audience you're talking to, then do a static image. But if you have also a vast data set, so more complex, interactive visualizations are good for large data sets, and that's what we're trying to do when we kind of talk about like this thing. It's like, what are you trying to do with the data itself? How are you trying to tell that story? So I wouldn't actually compare one against the other. Both are entirely valid and relevant for whatever you're trying to do.
Okay.
Yeah, we can wrap up. So just to kind of remind people about this, do take a look at the website. There's information about how you can order it. And please tweet at us with your favorite visualizations. If you can find them online, just send a link or post an image, and we'll be in touch about sending you your free copy. And if you want to stay around and stick around and talk, that's fine. But